Ryan, you're incredibly welcome to our third hangout. I'd love to hand it over to you initially. I'd love to kind of find out a little bit about your background before joining Redpoint, and then just a little bit about the firm and a little bit about your focus, just for everybody listening.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you guys for having me, and for those of you tuning in the middle of an Apple event, that's even more appreciated. So, so my background, as of last week, I've now been at Redpoint 1 full year. So I'm very new at this, so anything I say, take with a total grain of salt. But yeah, it's been 1 full year in venture, and still learning a lot along the way. Prior to my time at Redpoint, I spent 4 years at Twitter. So I joined around 30 employees. It was back in 2009. Twitter was starting to become a phenomenon already, but the company was still really small, and I joined to kind of run BD, partnerships, and our platforms, all of our API relationships, policy, partner support, all that kind of stuff. Obviously, amazing, kind of interesting 4 years there. Lots of tumultuous times, lots of great ups and downs, lots of learnings. But it was crazy. I left in those 4 years. It went from 30 to around 2,500 people. So just incredible kind of growth and development of the company. You see a lot of different changing things. It was pretty awesome. Prior to that, I was at a company called Skyhook Wireless back in Boston, where I spent 3 years there, and that was kind of an interesting company. It was Wi-Fi and cell tower positioning. So we used to have drivers drive up and down every single street in kind of the given major metro areas around the world, logging all of the wireless signals and building out a database of where all the access points were, with the goal of eventually having that database be something you could deliver kind of GPS-like location on devices that only had Wi-Fi or cell towers, not GPS. And we became known because we delivered that for the first version of the iPhone. So I can't really remember back, but I think it was 2006 or 7. When the first iPhone came out, you could hit a button on the map that would give you a location even though there wasn't GPS in there. And that was our stuff. We were a 10-person company. So that was pretty awesome. And way prior to that, I was a self-taught programmer, college dropout, kid that played hockey, and somehow ended up in technology and programming. So that's only the quick version of it. I think sometimes I feel like the only person in venture that didn't go to Stanford, and especially Stanford Business School. So I'm definitely a unique path into venture, for sure.
Diversity is a good thing. So you joined. How long ago did you join Redpoint, and what's your focus there, and what about the fund?
Yeah, so it was about a year ago, like last week. And my focus, it ranges because of my time with Twitter. Obviously, I look at a lot of kind of social and mobile stuff. I'd spent a lot of time with the Uber guys, and they're good friends. We're some of the first users. And so I've been around that business for a long time and totally appreciate and understand kind of the on-demand apps and services that are coming together. We as a firm have done a few other investments like that, one called BP, which is for cars, HomeJoy, which is for home cleaning and home services. So as a fund, we think about that stuff a lot, and as an individual partner, I focus on that a lot. But also my background, at Twitter and developer platforms and just some interest, I also care about enterprise services. And kind of developer platforms. Generally, I like to work on stuff that touches users in some way. So whether it's a consumer app that's delivering an experience to users, or an enterprise app that's touching a bunch of people across an organization like a Slack or something like that, those are the ones I probably get the most excited about.
Great. So I'm going to bring in a moment, just to my left here is John, and John looks after all our investors. So we've got about 800 investors coming, and he's got a kind of spidey sense for what they're all looking for, and he's built a kind of a great team that really kind of every day they're just talking with investors around the world. So we'll come to John in a few moments, and I'm going to ask him a similar question that I'm going to kind of ask you to begin with is, why do investors come to conferences? What's a good result from a conference?
It's a good question. I think when you look at the job, your entire job is about relationships and kind of meeting people, but you're constrained by time. There's only so much time in a given day and in a given week, and you have to try and figure out if one, you spend it with your portfolio companies and trying to help them be successful. Two, you try and network with the people you already know. So if you already have a network of people that are entrepreneurs, how do you work with them to try and figure out if a new round is coming up that you want to invest in? And the third bucket is kind of building and growing that network with new people. And with the kind of given times and constraints you have, it's about trying to find really high leverage ways to meet great people, and events are a great way to do that. Now, you could also skew too far and go to too many events, and I don't think you spend your time wisely. So it's about finding those kind of key events to go to that are the highest leverage, kind of most important ones to get to try and meet the most potential good entrepreneurs.
And so we do these hangouts for many of the startups that are coming to the Web Summit. But I think many of the same principles that I'm going to kind of ask you maybe to talk about apply at any conference. When you're at a conference, what type of kind of flags are you looking for, or at least what are the kind of do's and the don'ts in your view when it comes to a startup approaching you?
Doing a pitch? I think I look back at my own career, and I think it matters a lot in the same thing. It's about getting hustle in and making sure you try and get in front of people. But that hustle has to be paired with preparation. You can see a lot of people who have the drive and desire to talk to you about something, but they're not crisp in what they're asking for. They don't know exactly what the outcome there is that they're looking for, and therefore things start to wander and you don't get to a good result. So I think it's about being prepared and exactly kind of what you're looking for. Are you fundraising now? Are you looking for mentorship? Are you looking for connections? So a few different things that a typical investor can probably provide. And so be crisp in what you're looking for, and then be really crisp in helping explain your business. I think we've had a bunch of people that they'll come up and try and explain their business, and it just wanders and goes everywhere. And you can even kind of almost play it back to them in a crisper way. And you don't want that to happen, because it instantly kind of loses the kind of interest or trust of a investor. You want to know someone that really knows their business way better than you do, and is able to articulate it well, because that articulation is how you hire people, it's how you get customers on board, it's how you retain people and get your team excited. And so if you see someone who's kind of wandering in their own description of what they do, it's usually an indicator of someone who isn't crisp in how they get people excited about their business.
So give me an example of what does a good interaction, look like with a startup? Do you prefer, do you think startups should be approaching, not necessarily you, for example, but do you think it's better for a kind of a startup to, doorstep an investor and give the entire kind of 5-minute pitch, or is a conference an opportunity to kind of just build a relationship and it's kind of 30-second interaction and hopefully that leads to follow-up? Or what are your views on that?
Each investor is probably a little bit different. I like to take more time and understand, know it's a sector that I'm interested in. I know for me, ad tech and anything around ad tech is just something that I don't have a specific passion for. So someone could be incredibly crisp and explain their entire business to me in a few minutes, and that doesn't mean that I'm going to get excited about it. So I think having a relationship and understanding that you're both coming from a common ground, that you're interested in the business and understand the business well, and that goes both ways, right? Like an entrepreneur wants an investor who understands and is passionate about their sector. And so I think I look at it as relationship building and then using that as a bridge to an eventual partnership or an eventual opportunity to talk about it, a round or a deal. But I think knowing exactly what you're kind of looking for out of it and being articulate in that piece of it, and then building a relationship where you're kind of mutually respecting each other and feeling like you're both bringing something to the table is important.
So essentially, if I hear you right, you're saying a startup, certainly before a conference, and that can be the Web Summit, needs to take the time to kind of figure out, well, what investors are we going to try and hustle and track down, as opposed to just speaking to an investor. You need to be surgical about this.
Yeah, exactly. Some of the most amazing relationship things I've seen are someone who has looked up my background, knows kind of exactly what I've worked on, what I'm interested in, and brings that context to how they start the discussion. Like, hey, I know you were into developer platforms, and here's how that applies to the business we're doing, and we would love to talk to you about it because we think you'd be thoughtful about X, Y, and Z. That's a super fruitful conversation because now you know how to dig in. There's context for what you're both working on, and I think it makes it a lot more meaningful relationship instead of someone just coming and blurting out their business to you with no context as to kind of why it relates to you or is of interest to you.
So I'm gonna throw it open to John for a second. So anything you want to kind of chime in on some of these
of course. So there's been myself, I've spoken to like a few hundred investors over the last few months, and my team a few thousand. But we do hear, like you made a number of points there, which is very valid to startups, that investors aren't homogenous the same way that startups aren't. Like there's certain investors are suitable to certain startups, and when a startup usually sees the word investor, that's they just go for it. Whereas they're probably better off spending their time doing some due diligence and finding what investors are relevant to them, and then reaching out to them that way, rather than spending their time at an event trying to just find any investor, because it's not really necessarily going to lead to anything. It mightn't lead to anything that fruitful. as well on the investor side, they're not all there just for deal flow. Well, that's one of the primary drivers. They're there to meet with startups. They're not there to meet with any type of startup. So there are certain sectors or geographies or even stages that they invest in that it's going to be relevant to them when they're looking for startups to match with. So what we do, my team are now doing over the next few weeks, is making sure that investors' time is spent, well, as best as they can possibly do it over 3 days, meeting with the startups that are most relevant to them, which will then lead to the most successful conversations or lead to something into the future. So they're all the positive side of what I think startups should be looking for, they should be doing. But there are also, I think, a couple of landmines that startups can step on, and they can, at an event, when I see them dealing with the investors or they're pitching them, they cling to them too long. And there's a couple of other things they do that I think that they really blow the chance of it going anywhere. So I would be interested to hear your ideas if you think there are some things that startups do that you think are really the absolute no-nos and that really put you off a startup-investor relationship.
Yeah, I think you touched on it, and the relationship goes both ways in these, right? Like, entrepreneurs, if they're in a good business and running something well, are incredibly busy, and they should be thinking about how best to optimize their time for the best possible outcomes, in the same way that investors have limited time, and they want to invest their time for the best possible outcomes. So I agree with you. Trying to do that matching and thought process ahead of time is really important. And I think, like anything else, these are human relationships, and everyone feels awkward when there's someone who's just hanging too long around something that's not there, whether it's a date or a business relationship. And so thinking through, like, how does any one person want to be treated, and building a normal human relationship, and the best way to approach it. Have empathy, have understanding, and know that this isn't different than any other kind of relationship you'll have in your life. So yeah, I think you see some things where people probably get overly nervous, and totally understand that. The nerves are going to happen on both sides, but you're trying to find a way to be able to get your point across and build a relationship, but not sit there and kind of drive the point home for too long, because you're not going to get an answer at that moment. So start to build a thing, know that it's a long game, and don't try and solve it all in one meeting.
So one of the things that I've heard kind of repeatedly, it's kind of to your point, is a lot of investors would advise, and kind of experienced entrepreneurs is, at a conference, people only have a finite, that time is limited and there's lots of people to meet. So if you make an investor feel like this conversation might never end, they start sweating. And so if you can outline, it's only going to take 2 minutes, and let's follow up afterwards. It's kind of, it puts immediately the investors at ease that, okay, I'm not going to be here for 10 minutes because I've got to rush to another meeting, but I don't want to be rude and tell this guy that I need to cut him short. So I think to kind of reiterate what both of you are saying, I think for any startup that does interact with an investor, it's putting a kind of telling them, look, there's a finite timeline. Here's my 2 minutes. And if it's of interest, let's follow up post the conference. I think the reality is
basic. In the end, we're all selling, right? The entrepreneur is originally selling us on kind of their vision. Then when it suddenly flips and we're interested, we start selling them on we're the best investor for them. And so in the end, we're both selling a product of some kind. And so thinking through how to sell is important. It's about figuring out the kind of the humanness of each thing, letting people know exactly what they're getting into. Like you said, this is going to be a 2-minute conversation. Just want to give you a really quick idea of what we're doing, and then if there's interest there, let's follow up. It's a great way to start. People don't feel like they're going to be dominating their time. They're able to still kind of, a lot of times someone's going to go meet someone else. You catch them in a hallway. Now if I'm held up for 15 minutes, now I'm 15 minutes late to another thing, and I feel like a jerk or look like a jerk. So you want to try and be cognizant of other people's goals and schedules as well. So yeah, I agree.
I think something else would be very interesting for a lot of startups to hear would be the kind of typical, I don't know if you want to call it gestation period between an investor and an entrepreneur first interacting and then a kind of an investment. Building that relationship isn't necessarily an overnight thing, and the next day a check has been signed. What's a typical kind of time horizon look like?
Looking back at everything from this year, I can't say there's a typical structure yet. Some of them, honestly, when it's a really hot deal that everyone's working on, they can go as fast as 3 weeks. But at that point, it's not about someone reaching out to me. It's about, we know exactly who those deals are. You're going after them, and there's no, they're not emailing me to give me a pitch on their company and it's going 3 weeks. It's the other way around. We know the business well. We know the entrepreneur well. Suddenly they're fundraising and the project, the process is done in a few weeks. More typically, a lot of these are longer relationships. I'll know a guy for 6 months, 9 months, a year, be kind of getting slow updates on the business, be excited about the business, and like, okay, now we're going to go fundraise. And once that process starts, it's 3-4 weeks, maybe less. But the actual relationship building part of it can be months and months of time, sometimes years. So I think for me, the way I like to work is that, like, I don't want to rush into something. You're talking about a 7-year relationship after an investment. You're talking about an investor that can throw you out of your own company. As an investor, you're working with this person closely, so you really want to know that you work well together, that you're compatible, that you're going to be kind of a good addition to the team on both sides.
Yeah.
So I look at these things as, it's almost like a marriage. You need to take the time to kind of understand each other well.
And you touched on something very interesting, which was updates from an entrepreneur. So, say for example, you meet somebody in Dublin and you agree, let's follow up. Look forward to seeing some updates over the coming period. What does, for many of the kind of first-time entrepreneurs tuning in, what does an update look like? Is it a kind of a 6-page, 6-paragraph, 10-paragraph kind of detailed synopsis, or is it, what's an update? What's a good update from your point of view?
Brief, concise, to the point. It's about the things that are most important, like team additions. Who are the great people you're hiring? What's the traction and kind of proof points in the market for kind of market fit? And just some other basic. It depends on the business a little bit of exactly what those kind of we call them KPIs, but key performance indicators are. So if you're in enterprise sales, what are the big accounts you've landed? What does engagement look like? If you're on the consumer side, top line numbers, growth and engagement, that type of stuff. So know that like an entrepreneur, investors have very little time, and so they're not going to read a 2 or 3 page thing. And if you send that to them, they will literally probably read none of it. So you're better off sending fewer bullet points to kind of whet an appetite, and then getting someone to follow up afterwards.
Okay, and to completely flip it then for a second, and I'm going to come to John as well. So, startups have got essentially just under 3 weeks to prepare before Web Summit. In terms of what you think they should be focusing on in terms of maximizing their time when they get to Dublin, are there any things that you think the startups should be focused on right now before getting to Dublin?
I think if they're looking to meet investors, I think the biggest thing is, like John said, it's really look at the whole list, try and narrow that down, winnow that down to the ones that you think will be kind of your highest potential candidates, and then really do your research on them so that when you do meet them, you are already 2 or 3 steps forward in the conversation, and you can already provide that context of why this person should be interested, and you skip a lot of the small talk of trying to find that matching. Then if you have a short list of 5 guys, it's much easier to go find the 5 guys to go talk to instead of just randomly looking around a room for a guy who has an investor on his tag and then starting from scratch in that conversation. So I'd spend that time doing the research and doing the legwork.
Okay, great job.
Yeah, and so we've named just about half of the investors that are joining on the website, and next week we'll probably release another 100, and then the following week all investors that are joining. So we're giving people all the names and the funds and the geographies that people are coming from, so they can do their due diligence on investors that are relevant to them. So on one half, what me and my team are doing are matching up the investors with the startups that they should be joining with. But I wanted to hear from you what you think about, and what I see a lot of the startups where they make an error is that they don't, while you're encouraging them to do the due diligence and do the homework, which I think is going to give them the best return on their time at Web Summit, it's the companies that I've seen meet investors at Web Summit. It hasn't been a luck thing at all. They didn't happen to bump into them. So they actually went about creating their own luck. They identified who it was they wanted to meet, and they went about making sure they'd meet that person. Because all these guys here, we've got hundreds and hundreds of investor hours to go meet startups, but it's about making the right ones meet. But it's about making the startups aware that they really got to be active on the day itself. So if you have any ideas from other events you've been to, or what do you think about the Web Summit, how they should approach investors really, and while they should keep it short and they should identify who it is, I just really want to put the points across, put it out there that startups really got to be out there creating their own luck. It isn't about waiting to see what investors come by their booth. Well, some of that will happen. It's more about being as proactive as they possibly can.
Yeah, no, I think that's an incredibly good point. The ones, I've already gotten a few of them already. I think the other thing I'd recommend, if you narrow that list down to the 5, see what mutual connections you have to those people, and reach out to a friend to make an introduction ahead of time. Like as an investor, that's an amazing filter for me to already kind of narrow down to the people that I think will have high potential for us. Is if they're already someone kind of within our network and someone that I trust says like, hey, you might not know Patty yet, but he's one of the hardest working, smartest guys in the space. Even if it's not the right category for you, you guys should meet up and see if there's something mutual there. Those work incredibly well. So do the work to see if you have mutual connections and try and do an intro ahead of time, so you can actually try and set up where you're going to meet them. Let's grab coffee on Tuesday at 10 or whatever, get a phone number ahead of time. But I agree. I mean, on the other side of things, when I was at Skyhook and my job was to go meet every company out there, and Twitter was one of our customers, one of our potential customers, I was sending 100 emails a day to try and connect with people, and I'm hustling at events, and first one at the event, last one leaving the event. So it's a lot about the hustle and making sure you're there and you're present. And some of the most fortuitous things in my life have always been just about like showing up and being present. Even when you're like tired at the end of the day and you're like, so I really need to go to that other event, this is what you're here for. And like sometimes those fortuitous meetings, those serendipitous meetings, are the ones that prove out to be the most fruitful. The way I originally connected with Twitter was at South by Southwest. A mutual friend of mine who worked at Flickr knew the Twitter guys were reverse engineering our Skyhook stuff. I ran into this guy from Flickr at a bar, and he said he should talk to the Twitter guys. He made the intro, and we're off and running. So, if I hadn't gone to the bar that day, I probably wouldn't have gotten that intro, which means I probably wouldn't have made the connection or got you. So sometimes it's the right spot or just hustle and work it.
So I'm just going to ask if anybody's got, sorry to cut across, kind of any questions, feel free to kind of post them in the Google Hangout or on Twitter, and Brian will try and pick them up. I just wanted to reiterate one or two things I've heard from some of the other Hangouts, both from a great entrepreneur and from Robert Scoble. A kind of consistent theme that reaching out to investors or reaching out to anybody at a conference 3 weeks out sometimes might be a bit far out, but if you're reaching out 4 and 5 days out, people are beginning to zone in on that conference. And I think right now is a great time to do your research, figure out who you're going to kind of concentrate on. Alex Hawkins from Smart Things, who did a hangout with last year, talked about the fact that for every hour he was at a conference, he would spend 3 hours prepping for it. And that was something that he felt, and he's quite a successful serial entrepreneur, that people just kind of just didn't really think about putting in that effort in advance. So then kind of 4 and 5 days out, you start kind of pinging people, and if you're a relentless entrepreneur, you'll try every channel. You'll try Twitter, you might try Facebook, you'll try email, you'll look for that introduction, you might try LinkedIn as well. And I think, in my view, based on the feedback from lots of investors over the last number of years, they're all there. They want, they're there to meet incredible startups. Yeah, they're not there for any other reason. And if somebody, if I'm Peter Thiel, or if I'm Ryan, or if I'm anybody else, and suddenly I end up spending 5 minutes, if I suddenly end up spending 5 minutes with you because we've kind of figured out that we should connect, that entrepreneur has kind of got through an immense amount of noise to you, and that's in many cases already a strong indicator that this guy or girl is a kind of pretty tenacious entrepreneur. And there's, tenacious entrepreneurs tend to win out in most cases. It's not, any entrepreneur that I've met, and I've spent 4 years meeting the most incredible entrepreneurs around the world, and one thing they have in common is they are just so persistent. They never relent, no matter the obstacle or the problem. Hustling is just like, I don't know, is it a part of their DNA, if it's a particular gene, but they all seem to just hustle, and that means they hustle even if they're Elon Musk. They just don't stop hustling. And so that would be my just my kind of disjointed tuppence piece of work. So I just have one or two questions. So Peter Walter, he asks, how important is it to have a business plan on hand when meeting an investor?
Not important. In fact, I wouldn't hand out a business plan at that point. It's again about building that relationship. Be able to break down what you do and do a few statements and be able to kind of make that connection, see if there's interest there on the other side, and then do follow up later. Producing a business plan, then no one's going to read it in that moment, and it actually makes it a little more clumsy when you're trying to make that initial connection.
And when you're making that initial connection, I mean, if it's a mobile app, do you like just to get the kind of pitch at a high level, or do you appreciate somebody maybe giving you the physical product to play around with?
I think it's a bit of both. Like, you want to understand the kind of bigger vision and where things are headed and why an entrepreneur is working on this, like why they're personally passionate about it. But then you also still just want to see the product because, you guys know this well, but visions are great, but it really comes down to execution. And are you able to build a beautiful, useful product? It's really comes down to. So seeing both, I think, is good.
John, do you have anything to add before we?
I have seen people before. I say don't bring a business plan, but people put like 2 or 3 slides on their phone before, of just kind of like brand plan, whether it's either mock-up designs or a few different slides on what the business is. Those can be kind of quick and efficient. You're not having a big printout plan, but an easy way to kind of help tell the story of what you're doing.
Yeah, from my experience, something visual does help frame the 3 minutes, because if you only have 3 words, are a lot to take in. So if you do have something that you can show or explain, it just helps the speed with which you can get your explanation across.
So I'll add one more thing before handing over to Ryan, maybe for a final few words. So my experience going to a lot of conferences before ever organizing a really small tech conference for initially 5 years ago was that in many cases it wasn't the 9 to 5 where you extracted the best value or built the kind of most valuable, meaningful relationships. Oftentimes what happened post the conference each day from 5 p.m. to 3 a.m. Was the time when you could actually build much more valuable relationships. And I particularly found that the kind of 12 midnight slot to 3 a.m. where everybody was finished their dinner obligations or they were finished the speaker dinner, and they just found their way back to a particular lobby, and there's no set plan, but people kind of message each other, and suddenly everybody's in the W hotel. Nobody knows why they were there. There was no plan at 11 p.m. But if you can figure that out, this tends to be the time of the day when people's kind of guard is down, they're relaxed, they're enjoying themselves, and you can make a much more memorable impression. So I'm just saying to startups that, yes, get up at 7 a.m. You've got to work hard the whole way through the day, but the day only really gets started at about 5 p.m. and then it properly kicks off at about midnight, and then you got to go to sleep.
Those are my favorite hours of the day anyway, so that part's easy. But yeah, I totally agree. I think South by Southwest is another one of those great ones where I think it's so little about the content itself. The content is there to help bring people and create kind of a dynamic, and there's a few great sessions, but really it's about the social aspect and making sure you have that kind of planned serendipity where you're just in the right places at the right times, meeting the right people, you sit down for lunch and have a great discussion. I think be willing to invite other people into your group because you never know, who you're going to add to it and what connection they'll have. But go there with an open mind and kind of an open set of relationships to build. You'll succeed.
Fantastic, Ryan. Well, I really appreciate all your time and look forward to seeing you in Dublin in just under 3 weeks' time. So, until then,
thank you. Yeah. Thanks, guys, for joining, and glad we finally figured Google Hangouts out.